Hello everybody. So a while ago I made this Pong game in Pygame and people seem to quite like it. So I guess I add a little bit of stuff to it and make it a little bit more fancy. And specifically I'm going to add two particular things. The first one is to have a score counter so that you can actually tell who's ahead and who's behind. And the second one is to have a little bit of a countdown timer before the game starts so that it isn't that surprising and you have time to prepare. And covering those two topics should actually get you quite a few extra things in Pygame that are really important. Since it's been a while since I made the game, let's go over it really fast. So here's the final file I made in the first tutorial. And we are starting with a couple of functions. I'm going to talk about them in a second. We effectively start with the general setup, where we just initially add Pygame. That one's quite simple, and we create a clock as well. That one is basically used to make sure the game runs at a constant speed. Then we have main window, so here we just create the main display surface. And we have the display width and height, and we create a title. And I have called the display surface screen in our game. And this is the one that the player sees in the end. This is going to become quite a bit more important. If you have no idea how surfaces work in Pygame, check out the first tutorial. There I'm going to explain it in much more detail. But for the rest of it, here we set up some colors. Then we have the game rectangles. So these are the two players and the ball itself. Quite simple, and I use the screen to calculate where they should be on the display. Then we have some game variables, and this is just how fast everything is going to work. So these are all the basic variables we need for the game. Then we come to the while loop. And in this one, in this first part here, we are getting the player input, and we also get a function to quit the game once we're done with it. If we go on a bit further, then we have the game logic. And the game logic basically runs across three different functions. The first one's ball animation, then we have play animation, and then we have the opponent AI. Play animation and opponent AI are quite straightforward. They control the player and the opponent respectively. Ball animation is quite a massive function. You can find it right at the top. This one effectively controls the ball and makes sure that the ball collides. And this function also ensures that if the ball gets too far to the left or to the right, to get the ball restarted at the center, we use the ball start function. And this function is only called from the ball animation function itself. And we have defined it down here. And once we have those three functions, we just, in the visuals, display all of it. And then in the end, the two lines, Pygame display.flip just draws everything that came before it, and clock.tick determines our frame rate. It's less than 100 lines, and it honestly isn't that complicated of a code. But alright, let's start talking about the first thing I would like to add. And that is a score counter. So we just display how many points a player has scored. And to get this score, we need two things to make all of this work. The first one is that we actually need a variable that calculates what the score is. And that one's actually really easy. We can just use a variable to measure which one is which. But then we also need to display this variable in text. And that's a little bit more complex in Pygame. So let's first talk about how to display text in Pygame in the first place. To get text in Pygame, you need three steps. The first one is to create the font itself and the font size. So all this is that you create a basic font and tell it how large it should be. But at this stage, you don't actually create any text. You just create a blueprint for the text itself. And only in the second step do you actually add text. But the problem here is that this text is going to be added on its separate surface. So it's not going to be drawn on the main surface that we have created earlier, so the screen. Instead, Pygame creates its own surface and puts text on that. And because of that, we need step number 3, where we take the text surface and put it on the main surface. And that's basically it. So in our game, I will create a font, then I will use that font to create text on its own surface, and then I will put that surface on the main surface. So here we are back in the code, and I'm going to create a new section with a comment. And I'm going to call this text variables. And in here, I'm going to start with two variables that I'm going to call player, score, and I start with 0, and opponent, score, which is also 0. So those two are just integers that measure what the score is for each player. So that's quite easy. But next we need to create the font for the text that we want to use. So I'm going to call this, let's call it game font. And to create that one, we need pygame.font.font. And make sure you get the uppercase and the lowercase right. So the first one is lowercase, the second one is uppercase. Can be quite confusing. But now we need the font that we want to use. And in my case, I want to use Free Sans bold.ttf, which is a font that already comes with basically any computer, I think. Okay, and with that one done, now we need a second argument, and it's going to be the size of the text. In my case, I go with a text size of 32. So the larger the number is, the larger your text will be. And this covers the first step. So now we have a font and two variables that calculate what the score is. And with that one done, we need to create the surface where the text will be displayed on. And for that, I'll go a little bit lower, and I'm going to put the text below all the drawing stuff. You can put a little bit higher, but it needs to be above the background. So at least it has to be below this line. Otherwise, you're going to paint the text below the background, so you wouldn't be able to see. And I like all of these parts in one nice paragraph, so I'm going to add all of this afterwards. And now we need to create a surface with the text. And I'm going to start off this in the variable first. I'm going to call the first one player text. And to create a new surface with text, we need to start with the font. I called mine game font, and then we need render. And as arguments, the first thing we need to pass in is the argument for what the text is supposed to be. In my case, I'm going to use an f string and just pass in the player score. The second argument is if the text is anti-aliased or not. In my case, I don't really care about it, so I put it to false. But you could put true in here, it doesn't really matter. And then we need the color of the text. And in our case, we already have the color. It's the light gray color that we defined very early on in the game. Okay, and now we have a display surface. Now we need to put this surface on the main surface, so on the screen surface. And that one is done with screen.blit. And I don't actually know what blit stands for, but it puts one surface on another. So what we put into arguments here is the surface we want to put on the surface, and in my case this is player text. And then we need to position where to put this text. And in my case it's going to be 660 and 470. And I pretty much got these variables by trial and error, and they're roughly in the middle. And that's basically all we need. If I run the game now, we should have some text. Yes. So we see a 0 here. It doesn't exactly work yet, but that's going to come in a second. Okay, let's close it for now. And now we need to do the same thing for the opponent, because right now we only have the player text. So I just copy the entire thing and change player to opponent wherever it's needed. Opponent, player. This one's going to be opponent as well. And I also need to change the position itself. So this one's going to be 600. And if I run the game now, we can see both the score variables. Obviously they don't change right now, so we have to work on that. But otherwise we already have text. Now all we need is to update either of these variables, and then we are pretty much good to go for this part. Updating those is actually quite easy, and I'm going to do this in the ball animation part. And what we have right now is this one here. So that's the function that calculates if the ball has gotten too far left or too far right. So if the ball has gotten smaller than 0, this means the ball is very far left, or beyond the screen on the left. And if the ball right is greater than the screen width, this means the ball is all the way on the right. And we can use both of these to calculate if either player has scored a goal. But to really calculate which one is which, we need to separate them to two separate statements. So let's start with that one. And let me just rewrite them. And don't forget this function and the if statement. Now we have two if statements that do the same thing that we have done before. But the advantage now is that we can control which side the ball has entered. So on the ball left, this means that the player has scored a goal. So we need player, that was terrible writing, player score plus equals 1. And if the ball gets too far on the right, the opponent gets a score. So we have opponent score plus equals 1. This is going to work except for one thing, that right now we have a local scope, we're inside of a function, and we're trying to affect a global variable, which is down here. So by itself, this wouldn't work. we have to declare a global variable for these two. So this would be player score and opponent score. And you can see in the top here, this is a lot of global variables. And this ball animation function really isn't well designed. It's still working because the game is fairly small, but if it becomes any more complex, this is just really bad practice. I only did this because I started the original tutorial and didn't expect it to become much more complex. If you want to challenge yourself, try to avoid this by either using return statements or to create a whole class of the ball. But besides that, this should now be working. So let's start it up. And now the opponent got a score. And let's try it again. Yeah, this works. And all right, now we have a player score and we are able to put text on the screen. So now we can tackle the second part of this tutorial, and that is to create a countdown timer before the ball starts. And the really useful part we're going to learn in this part is about how to use timers in Pygame, which by itself is a really useful topic. So let's talk about the theory of timers in Pygame first before we get into the practice. So effectively in Pygame, you don't have a specific timer. So there is no function where you can just wait for a couple of seconds and then start another function. That just doesn't exist in Pygame. Instead, how timers work in Pygame is something like this. When you start Pygame, a timer starts to count from 0 until you stop the game. And you can measure on what time you are on right now. And you can do this multiple times. And with that, you can build a Pygame timer. And specifically what you need to do is that you first need to create a function that measures the time only once. So let's say at 3 seconds or 3000 milliseconds, that's how Pygame measures time, we have a function that runs once and returns the time. And after that, we repeatedly call a function and try to get the time again and again and again. And as soon as the difference between the original point and the current point is greater than, let's say, 2000, then we want to run a function. So that way we have made a timer that runs for 2 seconds. And the major problem here is that you really have to be careful about running a function once and running a function repeatedly, which sometimes really gets confusing. And the main reason for that is that we have a while function where everything is going to be run once a second. So running a function once can actually be quite difficult at times. And along with all the theory, here's another problem that's going to make this even more complicated. To make this kind of timer work in our game, we will have to rewrite a bit of the code. So I'll try to go over it quite slowly. So here we are back in our code, and the first thing we need is a variable that stores the time that we want to choose later. So I'm going to create a new section here, and I'm going to call it score timer. Seems okay. And I just create one variable that's going to be called score time. And I'm going to set it to none for now. But I'm going to change that in a little bit. But for now, none just means it doesn't really do anything. Now we want to make sure that when a score was gold, this function gets a specific kind of time. And this we can do quite easily up here. So we have a function when the player scores a goal and when the opponent scores a goal. So all we need to do in here is score time. And the command we need here is pygame.time.getX. And this would get us an integer that tells us for how long the game has been running since it was started. Or more specifically, since this pygame.init method was called. And we need to do the same thing also for when the opponent hits the goal. So now we have the starting point. And also this function is only going to be called once, which is quite a nice start to get this thing started. And the thing we need now is to have another function that repeatedly runs and checks the current time. And then we subtract the score time from the current time, and then the difference between them is the length of our countdown. But this is going to present us with a little bit of a problem. Oh, but before we talk about this in detail, score time is just like the player score. It's a global function, so this also needs to be declared at the top of the function. The best function to check the time would be the ball start function. But here's the problem. The ball start function would also only be called once, whenever a score is achieved. But this isn't good for our purposes, because we need to call this ball start function multiple times. So we need to do a little bit of redesigning of our code. And the way I achieve this is to just remove this here entirely from the ball animation function. And what I do instead is further down in the code, I put if score time is or evaluates to true, then I want to run the ball start function. And the basic idea here is that score time at the beginning is set to none, so this one would not be running. And this one would only be running if score time is something that evaluates to a true statement. And when we give it any kind of positive integer, like we do here or here, then this one would evaluate to true and the ball start function would be running. So effectively, we're working with the different types in Python and kind of exploiting how Python changes the types. But with this kind of setup, we basically made sure that now the ball start, whenever a score was achieved, is going to run on every single frame as long as the score time is something that evaluates to true. So now we just need to make sure that the ball start function, let's go to it, it is this one, that this one only starts again after a couple of seconds, and then once it is greater than this amount of time, it sets the score time variable back to none, so that this function doesn't run again. So to achieve all of that, we first need a variable that I will call current time. So now we check what is the current time. And this one is done in the same way that we approach the time for the score time. So this would also be pygame.time.getTicks. And make sure you understand the difference between these two. Even though they have the same command, they do something slightly different. This score time and this score time is only going to run once, so we get 1 point in time. Whereas current time gets us on what current time we are on right now. And then when we get the difference between these two, we basically made a timer. Because this one is going to get greater and greater, whereas this one stays the same. So basically what we want is that if current time minus score time is smaller than 2100, then I'm going to set the ball speed x and ball speed y to 0. And let me move to put the ball into the center of the screen a little bit higher up. Like, let's put a line between. So basically what happens is that when the ball start function is run, then we get the current time, the ball is going to be set to the center of the screen, and then we check if the current time minus the score time is smaller than 2.1 seconds, then the ball speed is 0. So the ball just stays in the middle of the screen. And now we just need a case when the difference is greater than 2100. And what I want here, I can actually use these two lines. What we want here is that the ball speed is 7 and it should be going in a random direction. And same for this one. So basically what happens is that here we take the time. Then we check if this time is smaller than 2100 or 2.1 seconds, then the ball isn't moving. And if it's greater than that, the ball is moving in a random direction. And the final thing we need is score time. It's going to be set back to none so that this function down here is not going to be run anymore. And again, we need to declare score time as a global variable. Again, I have way too many global variables in this code. It's really bad practice, please don't learn from me. But alright, when we're doing this, and it didn't work, and we get an error message, and the reason is quite simple, I forgot this second 0. And in case you haven't seen this kind of thing before, it's actually quite a simple way to just write something that's a bit more concise. What only happens here, we have two variables separated by a comma, and we have two values also separated by a comma. And all that Python does is it takes the first variable and assigns the first value, and it takes the second variable and assigns the second value. So let me get rid of this away. And now this should be working, right? And now we should have a timer. So it should start about now. Perfect. Now we have a timer. But this isn't great yet because the player doesn't know when the ball is going to start. So we need to add some text to show how much time is left. So let's do that now. And that's actually quite easy to do. because we have done this very same thing before. And the logic for that is actually quite simple, and we can actually reuse this one quite a bit. And what I want is to display 3, 2, 1, and then the ball starts. So to get a 3, we just want to display this one when the difference between the current time and the score time is smaller than 700. So this is going to be only on the screen for less than a second. And when we have that, I'm going to declare number 3 variable. And that's going to get, we can reuse, call it game font, yeah. GameFont.render just gets a 3. Then it's going to get a false because we don't care about anti-aliasing. And then we're going to call it light gray. And next we need screen.blit number 3. And the coordinates are going to be screen width divided by 2 minus 10, and screen height divided by 2 plus 20. So basically what this one does is that we take the center of the screen and move it a little bit to the left, because this point moves the top left of the number. So it needs to be a little bit offset to the left. And then screen height, we take the middle of the screen and we go down by a little bit. And remember, in Pygame, like in most games, if you want to go down, it's positive y values. Okay, so now we have the 3, and this is only going to show for the first 700 milliseconds. So we have to copy this entire statement. And now we want to show the number 2. So let me change those. Number 2 and number 2 down here. And this one's only going to show if the difference between the current time and the score time is either greater than 700 or smaller than 1400. And then we do the same thing again. And now we want the number 1. Number 1 here as well. And this is going to be a 1. And this is going to show when we are between 1400 and 2100. And after that one, we don't want any countdown timer because then the ball has started. And all of this should be working now. So let's try. And let me just get a score. 3, 2, 1. All right, perfect. So this is working now. And there's only one thing missing. That when we start the game, the ball starts immediately and there's no countdown at the beginning, which is a little bit confusing. But it can be fixed really easily. All we need is to change this none to any value that does evaluate to true. In my case, I'm just going to use true, but you can also put a 1 in here, or you can put any kind of text in there. It really doesn't matter, but I think true is the most straightforward one. And if we run the game now, then it starts with the countdown right at the beginning. So we are basically done. And this is a much more refined experience of the Pong game. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and let me know if you have any questions.